300 Years of Longing by Musu Li, Volume 1. Chapter 25. Rex Spiritus. The day he arrived in Herb Celestia, he was greeted by a celestial emissary holding a long jade scepter. The emissary greeted him with a smile. "Squire." People from Herb Celestia spoke with a soft upward lift on their sentences. Somehow, the emissary's tone gave the word a feeling of intimacy. That sounded rather nice, Yunhai thought. "What did you call me?" he asked. "Squire is what we call any celestial who hasn't received a formal title." "Will everyone call me that?" The emissary nodded. "Yes, everyone will call you that." "Including the chief immortal?" The emissary seemed startled, and a quizzical look spread over his face. Yunhai waved his hand as if to dismiss his words. It was just an offhand question. The emissary led him to the base of a seemingly endless set of stairs and pointed into the distance. "Squire, every new arrival to Herb Celestia must pray to heaven at the Spirit Terrace, accept the heavenly edicts, and greet the 12 immortals. The 12 are almost every celestial superior, especially Chief Immortal Ming-Wu." Yunhai was more than happy to comply. Xian rarely visited the mortal realm, and Yunhai only saw him a few times a year at most. "Almost every celestial?" Yunhai asked uncertainly. "Yes, there are 2 exceptions." The emissary must have explained this to many people before, and seeing Yunhai's curiosity, he decided to proceed. Neither of the 2 exceptions came to Herb Celestia through cultivation and apotheosis. Instead, they were directly invoked by the Spirit Terrace's heavenly principles. He explained what it meant to be invoked, then continued. Edicts from the heavenly principles are sent to them directly without passing through the Spirit Terrace, and no one else knows what they say. Naturally, they do not fall under the 12's jurisdiction. Yunhai was blown away. They receive edicts directly? Correct. Based on Yunhai's time at the Divination Commission, he'd always assumed that the 12 immortals of the Spirit Terrace were the highest-ranking immortals in Herb Celestia, with Xian at the pinnacle. He wasn't sure what to make of learning that there were 2 beyond even Xian. "Wouldn't that mean they're superior to the Chief Immortal?" he asked. As a subject of Spirit Terrace, the emissary was not equipped to answer this question. He paused, then said vaguely, "Those 2 particular immortals are not involved with trivial affairs. They don't accept offerings, and they don't follow the Spirit Terrace's proclamations. There is mutual respect between them and the Chief Immortal, and they do not interfere with one another." "What do they look like? What are their conferred titles? Are they easy to recognize? Should I try to avoid them if I encounter them in Herb Celestia?" Yunhai thought a bit, then smiled. "I like to joke around, and I'd feel terrible if I offended anyone with my ignorance. Please, emissary, do you mind sharing a bit more?" One was conferred the title Tianxiu. At his invocation, he was given the name Nian, God of Penance. He's rather easy to identify by the 3 mourning studs he wears on the shell of his ear. "Mourning studs? What are mourning studs?" "I don't know exactly. That's just what everyone calls them. Tianxiu was invoked very early. He was already here when the 12 came into existence, so of course the other celestials defer to him. He does not possess the kind of temperament that lends itself to closeness, so no one dared ask." "Then I'd better steer clear of him if I can," Yunhai thought. "And the other one?" "The other one, he precedes even the Tianxiu Immortal. He was conferred the title Rex Spiritus, and the name Jiao was bestowed on him at his invocation." Rex Spiritus. Yunhai waited to hear more, but the emissary suddenly halted. He turned, held the scepter in both hands, and gave a deep bow to someone or other. Yunhai tried to see who commanded such respect from an emissary of the Spirit Terrace, then heard the emissary address the visitor. "Lord Tianxiu, what are you doing at Spirit Terrace?" Startled, Yunhai watched as the Tianxiu Immortal himself came up the stairs. He looked quite young, with a commanding, if cold, presence. Even among the many immortals gathered in Herb Celestia, the Tianqiu immortal did stand out. Even with several flights of stairs between them, Yunhai could feel malevolence radiating from the 3 morning studs on his ear, like cold iron wedged inside warm jade. The contrast of arrogance and indifference was truly distinctive. However, Tianqiu was merely unapproachable, rather than condescending or rude. "I have business," he said evenly, nodding at the emissary. "We have a squire reaching apotheosis today," the emissary replied. "The 12 immortals may not have time to attend to anything else. Shall I inform them of your visit?" When the emissary mentioned his apotheosis, Yunhai smiled and bowed at the Tianqiu immortal. "My lord, you may enter the spirit terrace before me if you wish. I don't have anything important to do. I can wait." Tianqiu's gaze swept toward Yunhai, and he nodded. "No need," he said, in the same low, even voice. "You go ahead and pray. I'm not here to see Xian." The cold fog at the entrance to Herb Celestia moved again, and from afar, Yunhai caught the sounds of emissary guards bowing and making highly respectful greetings. "What a lively day this is," thought Yunhai as he moved to continue up the stairs. But the Tianqiu immortal halted, his gaze crossing the staircase to the entrance, as the emissary who had led him here hastened to bow again. Curious, Yunhai turned around, and saw a silhouette emerge from the fog. The figure wore a plain garment the color of white jade, its fabric trimmed with an intricate silver pattern. With his cuffs tightly fastened and robes cinched narrowly at his waist, he appeared tall and slender, moving with an aristocratic grace. Once through the fog, he did not proceed, but instead turned as though waiting for something. Soon, 2 celestial page boys trailed out of the mist. One had a long sword in his arms and was muttering complaints all the while. "My lord, it's so heavy." The sword was beautiful, its hilt engraved with fine silver filigree. Judging by how the page boy struggled to carry it, it also seemed unusually weighty. "As if it's any heavier than you. Give it here," the tall man replied. The page boy sprang into action at once, hurriedly throwing the sword to the man, who caught it easily. He wrapped his slender fingers around the hilt, twirled it deftly several times, and turned to continue briskly up the stairs. That was when Yunhai saw that the man wore a mask. It had a layer of intricate silver filigree matching the hilt of his sword, and exuded an air of otherworldly nobility. Among the crowd of celestials, the mask was as easily recognizable as the morning studs in Tianqiu's ear. "Who is that?" Yunhai quietly asked the emissary. "That would be the other one I mentioned," the emissary replied at a similar volume. The newly arrived immortal sauntered up the stairs, azure morning sunlight cutting across the cold mist of Herb Celestia to outline his slender silhouette. It occurred to Yunhai that Zhao, the name heaven had bestowed on him, meant luminous. "Why is Rex Spiritus wearing a mask? Is there some taboo about seeing his face?" asked Yunhai. "Well, it's not exactly a taboo," the emissary said under his breath. "It's just that every time he receives a heavenly edict, he dons a mask to conduct his business." "What sort of business?" "That only the heavenly principles know." The emissary stopped talking. Yunhai assumed that Rex Spiritus was as cold and unapproachable as Tianqiu, but quickly realized his mistake. Rex Spiritus climbed several steps before stopping in his tracks. Even with a mask over his face, it seemed as though he could see perfectly well. He inclined his head slightly towards Tianqiu, and though he did not speak, the 2 celestial page boys at his side did. They bowed to Tianqiu and yelled across the lengthy stairway. "My lord, our lord says we ought to apologize for the prank last time. It was just a misunderstanding." Tianqiu listened to them blabber, then replied without expression. "Forget it." "My lord, he says to forget it," the page boys reported, turning up their faces. Rex Spiritus let out a soft "oh," and pinched the bottom edge of his mask to lift it away a little, exposing a fair chin and a section of his straight nose. He smiled, then let the mask fall back into place. Holding the sword in one hand, he poked his page boys with the sword's hilt, and walked in their direction. Perhaps because he'd met them on his very first day in Herb Celestia, even before the other Celestials, the fantastical rumors of the Tianxiu Immortal and Rex Spiritus did not affect Yunhai too deeply. In the century that followed, he became one of the few people who had a rapport with both. His bond with the Tianxiu Immortal was shallower, mostly because that was just how Tianxiu was. As a god of penance, he lacked the time or space for close personal relationships. Conversely, Yunhai's bond with Rex Spiritus was deeper, because his personality made it easy. Even though Rex Spiritus seemed quite happy in a crowd, he lived rather out of the way. Yunhai wondered why. Herb Celestia had 10,000 jade pavilions, yet Rex Spiritus chose to live on the end farthest away from everyone else. Beyond being desolate and devoid of people, it was also directly next to the altar of deposed gods, a place everyone considered taboo. "Do you actually like this spot?" Yunhai once asked Rex Spiritus. "It suits me," he replied. Yunhai mentioned it to Xin, but he only said, "I don't know why he lives there, but he must have his reasons." Spirit Terrace and the two invoked immortals had little to do with one another, and Xin was the kind of person who lacked any curiosity about others. When they were together, he and Yunhai seldom talked about such things. More often than not, Yunhai was instead trying his utmost to bring a smile to his master's face, or even a frown. That was acceptable, too. Perhaps Xin's stoic manner when he came to retrieve Yunhai had seared a permanent brand on the young Celestial's heart, but for whatever reason, eliciting emotion from his master became Yunhai's obsession. He wanted Xin's face to betray real emotion, not the warm smile in his idols or portraits, but true delight or rage. Any emotion was fine. Sometimes he felt elation from making his master laugh, yet at the same time he scorned himself for it. Yunhai found himself quite strange. In the mortal realm, he disregarded everything but cultivation, for the sole purpose of entering Herb Celestia. Now that he was in Herb Celestia, he did everything he could think of just to bring the chief immortal, the most celestial of them all, a bit more down to earth. He failed often, but he succeeded at times. Even the Spirit Terrace emissaries noted that the chief seemed to have changed. Once, when Yunhai watched a smile spread across Xin's face, he thought, "Living like this for a few thousand years wouldn't be so bad. Perhaps I should take the injured and blind orphan I once was, and leave him for dead in that barren cave." Alas, it was not to be. Yunhai oversaw mortal rites of passage, and of all the gods, he interacted with the mortal realm the most. Sooner or later, he was bound to be faced with those he had once sworn to kill. He avoided 3 such encounters, but could not escape the 4th. The bastards could live to be 100 or more, a concept he found most unfathomable. So he killed them all. There were 31 of them, far fewer than his family lost. After the slaughter, he accepted a heavenly edict and set off to the Spirit Terrace to accept heaven's punishment. It was the first time he ever saw Xin truly angry. Chapter 26. Fallen God. The Spirit Terrace was neither a jade pavilion nor a raised platform, but comprised 12 suspended spires connected by covered jade corridors. Each of the 12 immortals was in charge of one, and Xin's towered above the rest. Every spire had a place set aside for genuflection and punishment, and the ordeal one must endure to earn penance differed in each. 12 spires, 12 punishment platforms, each holding its own tribulation, from mountains of sabers to seas of flame. Yunhai discarded his talismans before traveling from one spire to the next to continue his penance. He could barely stand by the time he reached Xin, but he stood stock still. His gossamer garment that once fluttered with transcendence now dripped with blood, and he'd singed his loose cuffs and hems kneeling among the preceding terrace's flames. He would never forget the way Xian looked at him in that moment. Deep beneath that dark cloud of anger, Yunhai was certain he could see a trace of tenderness, and though his every pore dripped blood, he burst into laughter. This only intensified Xian's anger. "Yunhai, you!" Yunhai had never seen his master enraged to the point where words failed him. Until now, Xian had always been good at reasoning with Yunhai, his admonishments delivered calmly, his demeanor collected and empathetic. Xian took care not to go overboard and left it up to Yunhai whether he wanted to comprehend. There were a million trivial matters in the mortal world, and Herb Celestia certainly had its own. Serious problems existed everywhere, yet none had ever made Xian this angry. "I am such a bastard," Yunhai thought, even as he felt a strange joy at eliciting this unprecedented reaction from Xian. "The day you entered Herb Celestia, you made a vow before the spirit terrace." Xian seethed. "The heavenly edict you received that day told you exactly which actions were permitted and which were forbidden. Did you think it was a joke?" "I did not, master. I remembered every word. I knew what the consequences would be, but at least I had my revenge." Xian had much more to say, but Yunhai's words left him speechless. "I got my revenge," Yunhai continued. "You knew I couldn't let those lying scumbags go on living without illness or pain. It was unfair." With that, he approached the punishment platform. Xian watched Yunhai step onto the suspended stone platform. After a long while, he turned his back on Yunhai and walked away. The things that aren't fair in the world could fill oceans. If you meddle in one, you must meddle in another. And someday... Yunhai knelt on the stone platform and waited for Xian to continue, but he did not utter another word. Yunhai knew the reason. Xian feared his words might be prophetic, pointing his disciple directly toward someday. Yunhai brightened at the realization. Xian waved a sleeve behind his back, and the punishment platform's stone door closed. As Xian's figure retreated from view, the smile vanished from Yunhai's face. Head hung low, he gradually fell into stillness again. The spirit terrace punishments were extremely draining, and 12 rounds at 12 different spires would render even the most hardy and obstinate of celestials unconscious and severely weakened. Yunhai came to in Xian's residence. The wounds he'd sustained were already dressed with celestial poultices and mostly healed. His damaged celestial core had also been mended, and though it would never be fully restored, it would not affect him overmuch. It was obviously the work of Xian. Yunhai rose to look for him, but the only people in the vast estate were several celestial page boys. "The chief said you may go, squire," they told him. Yunhai, who liked to jest and sweet-talk, had so thoroughly charmed Xian's page boys that they still called him squire, even though his formal title had been conferred long ago. Xian was the only one who called him Yunhai, or, at his most intimate, my disciple. "And if I don't leave?" Yunhai asked the page boy. "Did the chief tell you to drive me away?" The page boy shook his head. "He did not. He will not be here for the next few days, so if you aren't well, squire, please feel free to stay a few more days." Xian's page boys took after him and were also a bit stoic and painfully earnest. An affectionate pet name lost some of its charm when coming from their mouths, and by the time the words reached Yunhai's ears, they sounded dryly courteous, like squire was as stiff as this Lord Immortal. Yunhai sat at the edge of the bed for a moment before he shook his head. "I'm not going to stay," he said with a smile. "I'm going home. Tell your chief—" He fell silent for a beat. "Tell him I'm much obliged for the medicine and repair of my celestial core. I appreciate it." Before the page boy could reply, Yunhai was gone. From that moment onward, Yunhai gradually veered off the righteous path. He never intended to do so, but it was just as Xian said. Everything unfair in the world could fill oceans. He'd intended to meddle in mortal affairs just the once and leave the rest alone, but it was impossible. Soon enough, the result of his first meddling compelled him to interfere again. It was really quite simple. As a god of rites of passage, he witnessed all manner of partings and reunions. A person might joyfully marry one day and find themselves in the underworld the next. Yunhai often lamented these circumstances but never interfered. This was as it should be. Even Herb Celestia was not immune to partings. Every once in a while, a deposed god would fall back down to the mortal world. One day, he saw a girl kneeling before his idol. She had just turned 13 and was in the spring of her youth, as pretty as a cardamom flower branch bursting with green shoots, and she was already dead. The kneeling girl was a revenant who refused to let go, dressed in a wedding gown embroidered with runes. Presumably, someone had arranged for her marriage to a ghost. Her skin was bluish pale, and her eyes were empty sockets dripping bloody tears. Her lips had been sealed, so she could not speak. A folk method for preventing the dead from airing their grievances. But she didn't need to. The murderous aura that swirled so heavily around her made it clear exactly what she was praying for. Revenants like this often came from ruined families, when destitute children with no one left to protect them were forcefully taken as ghost brides. The only thing she could possibly want was the violent deaths of the ones who grabbed her. Praying revenants always wished suffering equal to or worse than their own on the offending party. The girl's eyes had been dug out of their sockets, and she wanted those who took them to suffer the same. Her tragic death demanded vengeance. Unfortunately, it was impossible. That wasn't how karmic retribution worked. According to the divine rules that bound him, Yunhai could interfere but not get involved. He could do only the minimum. That was what he'd intended from the start, even if the minimum was often nigh undetectable. He traced the girl's life back through several years and discovered that she'd been left in a shattered home with no one to protect her because someone seeking vengeance on her parents had murdered them when she was very young. That someone had been Yunhai. The girl's parents were among those who framed Yunhai's family. Therefore, he had to interfere, and he couldn't do just the minimum. If he did, the girl would just see him as another injustice in an ocean of wrongs. That was merely the beginning. Later, after endless meddling and countless interventions, Yunhai began to lock himself in his residence immediately upon returning from the mortal realm. He finally understood the meaning of Xian's unfinished sentence. There were enough wrongs in the world to fill oceans, and if he meddled in one thing, he'd inevitably have to meddle in another. Over time, more and more people would be involved. This one's enemy might be that one's benefactor, and the person this one wished to kill was the person that one wished to protect. The ties between problems were tangled and complicated, and if he meddled too much, someday his own existence would become the greatest injustice. Once he killed those 31 people, that day was certain to come. Each time Yunhai violated a heavenly law, Xian had no choice but to accept the heavenly edicts and demote him again and again. Once the god of rights who received plentiful offerings, Yunhai at last became the numen of the habitually ignored Valley of Laments. What's more, mortal offerings seemed to impact Herb Celestia as well. As his offerings and incense dwindled in the mortal realm, his home in Herb Celestia saw a steady decline in visitors. Yunhai was sensitive, and at first he assumed the Celestials were as elitist as mortals. That may have been part of it, but he gradually realized that the heavenly principles themselves dictated his increasing oblivion. When the other Celestials could see him, They still recalled who he was, but when he was out of their sight, he was equally out of their minds. The only celestial who seemed unaffected was Rex Spiritus. As a new resident in Herb Celestia, he had asked Xian, "I know Qian Shou is the god of penance, but what does Rex Spiritus oversee? It seems like nobody talks about it." Xian gave this some thought and replied, "He does what all the other celestials cannot. Even I don't know the details." This answer puzzled Yunhai. There were as many celestials as there were clouds in the sky, encompassing all that existed. What could the gods not do? He always assumed Xian's empty words were merely intended to elevate Rex Spiritus, but it eventually became clear to Yunhai that what Xian said was neither empty nor intended to elevate. There was a period during which Yunhai always felt uneasy, and it was then that he most often visited Rex Spiritus, who remembered him well. But Rex Spiritus's residence was attached to the altar of deposed gods, anathema to all celestials, so the one Yunhai visited more remained the Spirit Terrace and Xian. What he feared most was that one day, even Xian would forget that he once had a disciple named Yunhai. According to legend, there was a mysterious heavenly bell in Herb Celestia. None of the celestials could see it, but every once in a while, they could almost hear it ringing. The bell only rang when a god fell back to the mortal realm. Yunhai had heard it several times, but he never knew where the bell was hung, until the day he saw it with his own eyes. It was a rare long night in Herb Celestia, shrouded in fog. Yunhai was by the window when he suddenly felt the urge to see Xian. The desire came without warning, and he froze for a moment before deciding to close the window and leave his jade pavilion. As his hand touched the window frame, he heard a small rustle, like the sound of fabric brushing against metal. "Do I have a guest?" Yunhai spun around and came face to face with Rex Spiritus. He wore his hair high with a white jade crown, and a silver filigreed mask covered his face. Cold mist swirled around his tall figure like a cloak. He looked just as he did at the entrance to Herb Celestia all those years ago, but back then, light gilded his silhouette. Now, he was draped only in the darkness of night. Yunhai stared at him, his heart racing from fright, but he spoke casually. "Why mask up to visit a friend?" Rex Spiritus sighed near imperceptibly. "Does it look like I'm here to visit a friend?" Yunhai supposed not. Rex Spiritus was not attired for a lark, nor had he brought the page boys who were always at his side. He didn't even have the sword he was so fond of. Yunhai stood in place, and a tense air settled between the old friends. Rex Spiritus did not move or speak. There was an uncharacteristic lack of levity in his presence. Yunhai spoke first. "My lord, you've accepted a heavenly edict." "Yes," said Rex Spiritus. "Since you've already guessed that, you must know why I'm here." Yunhai's smile was bitter. "It's my turn to fall back to the mortal world?" Rex Spiritus did not reply, his silence itself an acknowledgment. "And here I thought all it took was a leap from the altar of deposed gods." Yunhai always thought falling back to the mortal realm meant stepping onto the altar of deposed gods and jumping. That would be that. Now that Rex Spiritus was here with the heavenly edict, he realized it wasn't so simple. His celestial core had to be destroyed to sever his ties to Herb Celestia. It was over in the blink of an eye, but felt everlasting because of the ineffable pain it caused. As agony enwrapped him, he saw something hanging from Rex Spiritus's fingers, a bell of white jade. Although he couldn't see every detail, he heard it chime, and at once understood where the heavenly bell resided. It didn't hang under any awning. It was carried on Rex Spiritus's person. "The heavenly bell," Yunhai said hoarsely. Rex Spiritus shook his head, his voice vague and distant. "The rumors are wrong. It's not called a heavenly bell. It's a dream bell." "Dream bell." Yunhai curled into himself, repeating the word subconsciously. he heard Rex Spiritus speaking to him. The mortal realm's not a bad place to be. The Mount Blossomfell Bazaar is really vibrant, and so much more fun than Herb Celestia. 9 shakes of this dream bell will weave you a grand dream. You'll step off the altar of deposed gods, and when you open your eyes, you'll forget what happened these past 100 years. You won't feel so bad anymore. When you open your eyes, you'll forget what happened these past 100 years. Was that why a bell always rang just before the other gods were struck back to Earth? I won't remember anything. I won't remember anyone. Without a celestial core, a mortal body could not hold on for long in Herb Celestia. Yunhai was already disoriented, but still he fought. As the white jade bell rang, he gathered his remaining celestial energy and threw in half of his soul to block the bell's effects. He had been obstinate his whole life, and he'd rather die on this hill than change his mind. He refused to forget. The first few years after Yunhai fell back to the mortal world, all was peaceful. Though he'd risked everything to block it, the dream bell still had an effect. He forgot everything that had happened in the past 100 years, beyond a vague impression of an old dream. In the dream, he'd broken his leg and blinded an eye, but a god had picked him up from where he lay, bloodied and starving, and placed him on the back of a deer. He tried to describe the dream to many people, but he always forgot what he wanted to say halfway and abandoned the story. He could never quite describe the setting, but he was certain it was a midwinter night. Cold shivers had racked his body, and the only source of warmth had been the god's hand. The disjointed dream inspired him to try learning thaumaturgy as a way to get a bit closer to the god in his dream. He inquired at many nearby cultivation clans, but none took him in officially. Each one said he had innate flaws that prevented him from gathering the vital force necessary for a cultivator's core. He just wasn't cultivator material. Then, without warning, the world fell into chaos. What little thaumaturgy he knew amounted to petty tricks that could not protect him, so he had no choice but to flee and hide, living like a vagrant. One night, he crossed paths with a fiend out scavenging for food. Unable to fight it off, his body became its vessel. Like losing an eye or breaking a leg, the feeling of his soul being consumed hurt and dragged an agonized scream out of him. While he huddled on the ground, he had a strange feeling of déjà vu. He seemed to recall having curled up just like this, using every last ounce of strength inside him to resist something. Something like the chiming of a bell. There was nothing more painful or more ironic than recalling, on the brink of death, the 100 years lost to oblivion. The god and his white deer that weren't just an empty dream. There really had been such a god, and that god had rescued him from a cold mountain cave. Yunhai remembered becoming the god's disciple and being praised for his exceptional talent. He remembered being the youngest person ever to reach apotheosis and becoming the god of rites of passage, a commission richly rewarded in offerings. He remembered that, on his final day in Herb Celestia, he had longed to see his master once more. But he hadn't seen him again, so how could he possibly die? Later on, Yunhai reflected that he really was quite talented after all. Only someone truly gifted could turn the tables and absorb the fiend consuming him, simply because he refused to die. Every cultivation clan had told him he lacked the ability to gather his vital force and coalesce his cultivator's core, but that wasn't quite true. While he couldn't form a celestial core, he did fine with the fiends. As he desperately consumed the infernal energy, a scene from 100 years prior flashed through his mind. His younger self, injured and hiding in a cave, and Xian coming toward him, lantern shining in the gloom. He knew no celestial would ever come to save him again. He'd barely survived, and until the end of his days, he wouldn't dare to see Xian again. Chapter 27. The End of the Reckoning. Yunhai lived the life of a fiend in a daze, as if he were stumbling through a city shrouded in fog the daylight could not penetrate. It was not terribly difficult. Ordinary people lived in fear and had to fight for their survival, while cultivation clans had to protect everyone, annihilating fiends and upholding justice. Fiends had the upper hand, because they only had to take care of themselves. Most fiends new to the infernal path would have been afraid of being killed when encountering cultivation clan disciples, but not Yunhai. He progressed at an astonishing pace, and even the leaders of clans had reason to fear him. He could have lived life to the fullest, unchallenged and unrestrained by rules, but he did not. Instead, he hid from cultivation clans to prevent the slightest hint of him from reaching Herb Celestia and a certain Spirit Terrace chief Immortal. He could no longer shift to other places by projecting an avatar, so he traveled to the southwestern hinterlands to learn forbidden hexes and bush sorcery. With more patience than he'd shown his entire life, he crafted a puppet even gods would struggle to tell from the real thing. He shaped the puppet's face in his own image, and left it in the city of Spring Pennant, where the Hua clan resided. Spring Pennant had a population of several 100,000, and the puppet dissolved into its crowded streets like a drop of rain merging with the ocean. Its chances of encountering a member of the Hua clan were infinitesimal. Still, he compelled the puppet to live an ordinary life, so it would appear that the Yunhai who fell from heaven to the mortal realm was living just as a commoner would. Once everything was in place, Yunhai left for Gui province, far from Spring Pennant. Fiends congregated there, and one more would hardly make much of a difference. Rumor had it that one could cultivate an Euthymia hex there, a hex that banished all feelings, including basic emotions. Since fiends were hedonists who enjoyed stimulation and pleasure, few, if any, cultivated the forbidden hex. Beyond the damage it might cause, sealing away all feelings would make one no different than the boring cultivation clan members who entered the path by relinquishing attachment. But Yunhai did cultivate the Euthymia hex. Once he sealed away his full range of emotions, everything that caused him pain ceased to torment him day and night. He had no sorrows, no joys, no fears, and nothing to lose. He saw no difference between a blade of grass, a tree, an ant, a cultivator, or a fiend, and was unconcerned whether they lived or died. What he was unable to accomplish in Herb Celestia, he finally mastered as a fiend. In hindsight, this too seemed unfair. The Euthymia hex suited him beautifully. He lived as a true fiend for several years, doing exactly as he pleased, and never dwelling on who or what he killed. Once, when passing through the city by Mount Immovable, he even heard the name Mingwu Huaxin and felt nothing. He looked up momentarily, but had no desire to linger. The only downside of the hex was its backfire effect. Every few months, he spent a day or two in frail and freezing agony, his sorcery and vital force unusable. These periods were an exquisite torture. Lost and confused from pain, he felt like his soul was torn into two, crying one moment and laughing the next, deranged, then tranquil. Each time he came to, he found himself covered in lacerations, half his face macabre and haunted from the claw marks he'd inflicted while lost in the pain. In the aftermath, he was once more without joy or sorrow, and thought his disfigurement wasn't such a bad thing. Half his face was human, and half was the face of a ghost. It suited him well. In fact, nothing could have been more fitting. Yunhai didn't know whether it was his ghastly face or his disturbing behavior, but throughout those years, even other fiends stayed out of his way. He believed he could continue living like this. He intended to survive as long as the gods in Herb Celestia. But perhaps the heavenly principles could not tolerate his existence, or, given his terrible deeds, maybe there was such a thing as karmic retribution. As for how it all changed, he could no longer say. He remembered hearing a piece of news one day. A group of fiends he'd driven from Gui province had taken refuge in the Valley of Laments. When he heard the words Valley of Laments, he sneered and didn't even think back on his boring past as Newman of the Valley. Soon enough, he heard that one of Spring Pennant's merchant caravans was lost in the Valley of Laments, and the fiends were enjoying the spoils. Among the dead were some ordinary commoners who'd wanted to travel through the valley under the caravan's protection. One of them looked the spitting image of Yunhai, so much so that the fiends, in their fear, almost didn't attack until they were certain the commoner merely resembled him. Yunhai realized right away that the commoner must have been the puppet he'd planted in Spring Pennant. His reason for making the puppet was to fool someone in Herb Celestia into believing he was living a quiet life as a commoner. After cultivating the Euthymia hex, he no longer concerned himself with such trivialities. When he heard of the puppet's demise, he felt a moment's surprise but didn't take it to heart. A puppet had died, and that was all. Aside from rendering the 3 days and nights he'd spent shaping it pointless, it caused him no harm. If he didn't care, there was no reason anyone else should either. With that, he put all of it, puppet included, out of his mind to never be thought of again. But then he heard that news of the commoners' deaths had been reported to the cultivators guarding Spring Pennant, the Hua clan. Supposedly, they'd sent people to the Valley of Laments post-haste. It was hard to describe what Yunhai felt in that moment. The Euthymia hex was still in place, and it would be days before the next backfire period, so he should have been indifferent. He went about his business as he typically did for 1 day, then 2 days. He didn't make it to the 3rd, for by the end of the 2nd night, he was atop the high precipice at the Valley of Laments. He'd once been the Newman that protected this place, but it had been so peaceful then that nobody had bothered to pray for protection. After he fell back to the mortal world, the valley was overrun with fiends and no longer so peaceful. Yunhai traveled to many places over the years, but never returned to the Valley of Laments. Now that he was here again, he found the shrine still there, but his idol gone. To his surprise, on the altar that had been ignored for years, he found several joss sticks still burning. He stood outside the empty shrine and stared at the steel blue sky for a while, then followed the scent of fiends into the narrow gorge. In that moment, his soul seemed to split into two. One half asked, "What are you doing here? What does it have to do with you?" The other half replied, "I must take care of these fools and make another puppet." He wanted to clear out the fiends ravaging the valley, then leave another puppet somewhere near the caravan before the Hua clan arrived. He had even planned out how many injuries he should give it, how wounded it should be to not seem strange, and whether he should make a few other commoners as well. The only thing he hadn't decided was why he had to do any of it. Why make the puppet Yunhai appear to have narrowly escaped the disaster and barely survived? And why have the Hua clan bring it back to Spring Pennant to continue living out its life as an ordinary commoner, safe and sound? And then what? Wondered Yunhai. Who is it putting on this act for? Who would care? Oh, sure, no sorrow or joy here. Cut off from emotion and love, indeed, Yunhai thought mockingly as he wrapped his black robes around himself. With soaring infernal energy, he purged the valley of fiends. These fiends were afraid of him to begin with, and they were no match for him when he was in a bad mood. Even he could not control his rage. At the end of his killing spree, his fingers trembled with excitement, but while he'd slaughtered the fiends, he had not spared the caravan's corpses. His earth-shattering infernal aura had ripped them to pieces, and the husks flew high in the air before drifting back to earth again like torn silk. Only when rocks crashed down from the mountains did Yunhai regain some awareness of his surroundings through the veil of his infernal aura. He was about to restrain himself when he heard the metallic whistle of a sword approaching like a gale from beyond the heavens. The blade pierced the swelling infernal aura blackening the valley, and beelined right for him. Instantly, his pupils contracted, and he stiffened as though sinking into the ice-sealed, boundless sea. He didn't have to see the sword to know who it belonged to. He could tell by the sound alone that it was Xian's sword aura. Yunhai had imagined their reunion many times. He knew that day would never come, but he could not stop himself from thinking about it. He imagined he would try to avoid Xian, disappearing without a trace long before Xian could notice him. He also imagined he would feel nothing when they drew their weapons against one another, just like he'd felt nothing when he heard someone near Mount Immovable say the name Xian. He'd never imagined that he would conceal the half of his face that belonged to Yunhai, revealing only his monstrous side, as he pulled Xian from the heavens and into his ink-black infernal aura. Evading the sword's bright gleam, he parried and sneered with a voice so hoarse it was unrecognizable. "The Valley of Laments is of no import. It's a place where a merchant caravan and a few commoners met their ends. That's all. How is it worthy of an armed immortal's attention?" Through the infernal aura swirling around them, neither could see the other, but Yunhai could feel the unmistakable killing intent behind Xian's sword aura, which only grew stronger as the fight went on. Yunhai didn't know why, but that feeling made his heart beat like a war drum. Maybe his years of going around in circles had just been filling the time until this day came. Yunhai taunted Xian over and over to quicken his attacks, feeling Xian's killing intent grow. Beneath his sword intent, the stones shook and the mountains themselves trembled. He saw Xian unleash a vital move, the tip of his sword aiming for Yunhai's solar plexus with the might of 1,000 troops and 10,000 horses. Yunhai relinquished all resistance. As the sword pierced his heart, celestial energy exploded along the tip of the blade, clashing violently with the infernal energy coursing through his body. The blow struck him so hard, it drove him into the ground and pinned him there. Xian followed his sword, gathering energy in his palm to inflict another grave injury. As his palm struck, the earth split. The thick, black, infernal aura was pushed aside, revealing the unmarked half of Yunhai's face. Everything went still. The chief immortal of the Spirit Terrace's vital move could not be blocked, and Yunhai had not tried. The only possible outcome was the dissolution of his soul and certain death. Yunhai had never before seen Xian make the expression he made now. In an instant, his jet-black eyes widened, then trembled. Yunhai saw his own face reflected in Xian's eyes, half human, half ghost. A winding river of blood flowed beneath him. He felt his soul crumbling to fragments and dissipating. He felt his infernal aura, freed from the shackle of his husk, flow into the valley like clouds. And he felt the chief immortal's perpetually warm hand, which was now cold as ice. "Yunhai? Yunhai." Xian's voice was hoarse, and so soft. He wondered what expression Xian wore while he called his disciple's name like this. Was it pity, or was it heartbreak? He was quite curious, but he could no longer see. His senses flew from him like startled birds. His consciousness was fading. He was about to die. He felt a satisfaction he could not articulate. "See? At least you won't forget me." In his last second, he smiled. "I'm still such a bastard." Immeasurable darkness mingled with fading infernal aura. It wasn't until Xiao Fuxuan's sword stopped ringing that everyone registered the reckoning was over. A person's memory was a collection of fragmented images to begin with, and during the reckoning, they crisscrossed and wove together. Unlike the Tianshu Immortal, the god of penance, an ordinary person could only catch cursory glances, unable to perceive the whole. They could only hold on to fleeting images and indelible impressions. The long white jade staircase Yunhai saw on his entry to Herb Celestia, the unfathomable torments he endured on the Spirit Terrace's punishment platforms, Rex Spiritus, the masked immortal never named in the Book of Gods. When the reckoning drew Ning Huaishan and Feng Chu back to the vault, this last scene was the very first they saw. The scene left a deep impression on them because something about the way Rex Spiritus caught his sword gave them déjà vu. They were so certain they'd seen it somewhere before that they were still mulling over it when the reckoning concluded. It was a long time before they came back to themselves. Then they heard it, an infinitesimally quiet intake of breath from within the deep hollow. Jolted back to the present and compelled by curiosity, they huddled at Wu Xingxui's side and leaned forward to peer inside the hollow. Under an entangled web of vines, wrapped in black robes and subdued for several hundred years, Yunhai opened his eyes. His pitch-black pupils focused on the first person he saw, the one looking down from the side of the hollow, Wu Xingxui. He stared at Wu Xingxui, then parted his parched, cracked lips, and called out a name. His voice was so rough it barely made a sound, but following the motion of his lips, it was clear that he said, Rex Spiritus. Rex Spiritus, the unknown immortal, given the name Zhao by heaven. Feng Chu and Ning Huaishan were too stunned to speak. That's all for now. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.